I've been driving trucks for over 15 years and I've seen my share of weird things on the road, strange people, eerie rest stops and places that don't sit right with you, but nothing has ever gotten under my skin like what happened one night in West Memphis, Arkansas. Back in the fall of 2019, I was hauling of produce from Dallas to Nashville, running late, so I decided to stop for the night at a truck stop just off I-40. It wasn't my first time there, a flying J off the highway near an old run-down diner called Roy. Not the worst stop, but something about it always felt off. My dog Noodles, a scruffy old mutt who's been my co-pilot for years, sat up in the passenger seat sniffing the air as I pulled in. Normally he'd just curl up and sleep, but tonight he was alert, ears perked up. I should have taken that as my first warning. The lot was half full, a handful of rigs idling on the crisp October night. It was quiet, too quiet for a truck stop. No sounds of chatter, no rumbling engines, no music from a nearby cab, just the hum of the street lights buzzing overhead. As I climbed out, I felt it immediately, that weird prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching. I did a slow scan of the lot, nothing but rows of trucks and the faint glow of the diner's neon sign flickering in the distance. Still I couldn't shake it. I grabbed my wallet, patted Noodles, and told him I'd be back soon. His eyes followed me as I locked the door behind me. He didn't look happy about it. Inside Roy's, the smell of burnt coffee and fried food hit me like a wall. The place was mostly empty save for a tired-looking waitress behind the counter and an older man in the corner hunched over a plate of something unappetizing. I picked a booth by the window and ordered a simple meal: eggs, bacon, toast, nothing fancy. The waitress nodded, barely looking up. The place was dead silent except for the low hum of a radio playing some country song from the 80s. It wasn't until I got up to use the restroom that things took a turn. I was gone for maybe 2 minutes. When I came back, everything looked the same except for one small detail: my fork had moved. Not by much, just a couple of inches to the left. At first I thought I was imagining it, maybe the waitress came by, but my plate was untouched and I hadn't heard anyone near my table. A cold feeling crept up my spine. I looked around. The older man in the corner was still there, staring down at his plate. The waitress was behind the counter, jotting something down. No one else trying to shake it off. I sat back down and finished my food quickly, but the whole time I couldn't stop glancing around, that uneasy feeling pressing down on me. I paid my bill and left. Back at the truck, Noodles was pacing in the cab, whining softly. "Relax, buddy," I muttered, unlocking the door. But as I climbed in, my eyes drifted past the lot towards the edge of the trees beyond the gas station, and that's when I saw him, a figure barely visible in the dim light, standing just at the tree line, too far to make out a face, too still to be just some random guy stretching his legs. He was watching me. I sat there frozen, my hand still on the door handle. Then he moved, not towards me, not away, just a slow, unnatural shift, like he wanted me to know he saw me. To the air inside the cab felt suddenly suffocating. Noodles growled low in his throat, his fur bristling. I locked the doors. The figure stayed for another few seconds, then without warning he disappeared into the woods. Not walk, disappeared. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I was still shaken. I debated whether to report it to someone, but what would I even say? Hey, some guy stood in the woods last night and stared at me. Instead I went inside the Flying J to grab a coffee. Before heading out on a whim, I asked the cashier, an older guy with deep lines on his face, if he'd ever seen anything weird around here. He sighed and rubbed his chin. Yeah, now and then solo truckers mostly say they see someone lurking, messing with their trucks. Police never find him. That cold feeling came back. I Told him about my fork, about the figure. In the woods, his expression didn't change. You check your food, he asked. After a moment I felt my stomach drop. What do you mean? He sighed again. A couple of years back some guy was drugging food in the diner, slipping stuff in drinks and meals, never got caught, but after the cops got involved, the report stopped until a few months ago. I felt sick. I hadn't noticed anything weird about my meal. I felt fine. But the fact that someone had been at my table, had touched my food while I was gone. I thanked him and walked back to my truck feeling like my skin was crawling. Noodles was still on edge, his eyes darting towards the woods as I climbed in. I didn't waste any time. I fired up the engine and got the hell out of West Memphis. I don't stop in West Memphis anymore. Before we dive into the next story, if you're visiting our channel for the first time, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell icon to stay updated with our upcoming scary stories. My name is Eric Donahue. I've been a delivery driver for the last 8 years, mostly running overnight routes through Arizona and Nevada. I've had my fair share of weird encounters, people walking in the middle of the road, distant lights in the desert that don't make sense, but nothing comes close to what happened on Highway 93. This was about a year ago in late September. I was making a run from Phoenix up to Henderson, Nevada. If you've never driven that stretch, let me paint a picture for you. It's long, dark, and empty. Most of it is just desert, an open highway with a few small towns that feel abandoned. After sundown you could drive for miles without seeing another car. That night it was around 1 a.m. and I was cruising along listening to some late night talk radio to stay awake. The road was dead, no cars ahead, no headlights in my mirrors, just me in the highway. Then out of nowhere a car came up fast behind me. It was a silver sedan, maybe a Honda or a Toyota, and it was flying. I remember thinking the driver was either drunk or desperate to get somewhere. It swerved slightly as it approached, then settled into the left lane to pass me. That's when I saw her, the woman in the passenger seat. Her face was pale, almost too pale under the glow of the dashboard lights. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, locked onto mine as the car pulled up alongside me. Her mouth was slightly open, like she wanted to say something but couldn't. I glanced at the driver, but I couldn't make out much, just a dark silhouette, hands gripping the wheel. Then in a split second the car sped up and pulled ahead, disappearing into the darkness. Now weird things happen on the road. People drive erratically, passengers do strange things. I told myself she was probably just tired, maybe even messing around, but something about her face stuck with me. Not just fear, it was something else, like she was trying to warn me. I kept driving, shaking it off. Maybe 15 minutes passed. I hadn't seen another vehicle since, and then headlights in my rearview mirror coming up fast. The same silver sedan, it blew past me again, the same as before, but this time the woman's face was different, still frozen in fear, but now her mouth was open wider, like she was silently screaming. And then, just like before, the car sped off, vanishing into the night. At this point I was awake, fully awake. My hands were tight on the wheel, my skin prickling. There was no way. I had just imagined that. I slowed down, slightly scanning the road ahead, half expecting to see the car pulled over or wrecked in a ditch. Nothing. Another 20 minutes passed. The radio was just static. Now I had shut it off without realizing it. I kept checking my mirrors, waiting for those headlights again, but the road stayed empty. Then, just as I started convincing myself it was over, the headlights appeared. The same damn car. This time it didn't speed past me. It stayed behind, just far enough that I could barely make out its shape. I couldn't do this anymore. I grabbed my phone and called 911. 911, what's your emergency? I felt ridiculous even saying it, but I told them what happened, that a silver sedan had passed me twice, the same woman in the passenger seat looking terrified, and now it was following me. The dispatcher was calm and asked for my location. I gave it to her. Sir, there are no reports of any vehicle matching that description on your route. That didn't mean much, but it unsettled me anyway. She told me to keep driving toward the next town. Kingman wasn't too far and that an officer would be on the lookout. I thanked her, hung up, and checked my mirror. The car was gone. Not pulling off to the side, not slowing down, just gone. I must have checked my mirrors every 10 seconds for the next hour. Nothing by the time I reached Kingman. I pulled into a gas station just to breathe for a second. The lot was empty except for a trucker fueling up. The air was cool and smelled like diesel. Normal. Safe. I called dispatch and told them I was taking a short break. Then, just out of pure paranoia, I asked the cashier if he'd seen a silver sedan pass through recently. He thought for a second, then shook his head. Not in the last couple of hours, man. I didn't say anything, just nodded, paid for my coffee, and got back in my truck. I finished my route, made it to Henderson, and just fine. But the whole drive I felt off, like I wasn't alone in the truck, like someone was watching. I checked the news the next morning, looked for reports of a missing woman, an accident, anything. Nothing. I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was a trick of exhaustion. Maybe it was some messed up coincidence, but part of me, a big part, thinks that woman was trying to tell me something, and whatever it was, I didn't stick around to find out. The worst thing I've ever experienced was around 1996. I was team driving with another individual. We picked up our load and scaled it out. I opted to drive the first shift. I drove in solid rain from Detroit, Michigan to just shy of St. Louis, Missouri. We swapped out at a rest area and caught our logbooks up. I was tired after driving for 10 hours all night in the rain. One thing I'll never forget was before I started driving that night, the other driver, will call him John, said to me before going to sleep, if we get killed, I'll come and haunt you. He said it with a smile and zipped up the curtain to sleep. After swapping seats, I zipped up the curtain and put a movie on to fall asleep. My cousin Vinny. The thought that crossed my mind often while in the bunk was what I would do if we were going over an embankment or a cliff. My best decision was to hit the deck, get as low as possible, and pray. While watching the movie, I started drifting off to sleep. It was maybe 45 minutes later when I woke up to John saying, "Hang on." I could tell that we were weaving or something wasn't right. He yelled again and I hit the floor, praying hard. Were we going over a cliff? I couldn't see the front because the curtain was zipped closed. The next thing I felt was the entire truck vibrating. For a split second I could tell there had been a violent impact. The strange thing is that there was no loss of forward momentum. From the impact, we were near full GBW of 80,000 pounds. I'll never forget that sound and feeling as long as I live. Right after the impact, it happened so fast I didn't even know what had happened. We had slid on wet pavement, gone airborne in the median, and ended up in oncoming traffic west of St. Louis on I-5544, just west of Away Station. After hitting a vehicle head-on, our semi had flipped over and was now facing east. Suddenly everything was quiet. I was in shock. John asked if I was okay. I said, "Yeah, let's just get out of here. I smell smoke." I had been sitting on the passenger side of the floor during the wreck. Now the roof was a door for me to crawl through. On my right, Joan soon followed behind me. There I was standing in my socks on a wet highway mixed with diesel fuel. Smoke was coming from the hood, which was barely recognizable. I wasn't even awake enough to comprehend what had just happened. I remember people running to the white pickup truck we had hit, Hedon, with fire extinguishers. It was like I was in a dream. I couldn't comprehend what was going on. I remember shivering with blood coming from my hand and mouth. When I got myself together, the fire was out. The next thing I remember was an ambulance Attendant talking to someone on the passenger side of the white truck. I could tell she was consoling the person. I saw her mouth the words I knew with a compassionate face. The next thing I knew, John and I were in an ambulance headed for the hospital. I was looking out of the back doors, through the windows as we were pulling away. I started crying uncontrollably, trying to imagine the fear that the people in the white pickup must have felt seeing this semi coming right at them. I purposely left out a few gory details that nobody should ever have to see or even hear about. When we got to the hospital, I learned that all three in the truck hadn't made it, a man, his wife, and their 4-year-old daughter. I felt the same kind of guilt as the gentleman who mentioned giving CPR to the driver on the ground in a previous comment. Why did I survive a horrific accident that killed 3 people? I'll never forget the smell that morning, standing in diesel fuel mixed with rain and smoke. As it turned out, that stretch of highway was nicknamed Blood Alley because of the deep grooves in the road. It had been the site of many accidents. Many months later, I drove through that spot and saw they had patched that stretch of highway. I wish it could have been done sooner. It was very painful to bring this up after all these years, but it serves as a reminder to give driving 100% of your focus, especially now with people texting, eating and reading while driving.